Your soulmate truly loves you, but one unexpected detail about you has them completely conflicted. Do not scroll away from this yet, because the part that has them conflicted is probably not what you think. It is not another person. It is not that their feelings disappeared. It is not that they suddenly stopped seeing a future with you. In fact, the truth is almost the opposite. The deeper their feelings have become, the more this one unexpected detail about you has started affecting them, and last night, in this fictional story, they finally admitted to themselves that they could no longer ignore it. So stay with me for a moment, because if you leave too early, you are going to misunderstand the entire situation. The person you love has been carrying something quietly. They have smiled around others. They have acted normal. They may have even convinced themselves that everything was fine. But beneath that calm surface, there has been a question repeating in their mind, especially when they are alone. A question about you. A question about whether they are truly ready for someone like you. And that is where the conflict begins. Because they do love you. More deeply than they expected. More seriously than they planned. And maybe that is exactly why this detail matters so much. It is not something wrong with you. It is not a flaw. It is not a secret you should be ashamed of. The unexpected detail is something about the way you love. The way you see people. The way you notice things others overlook. The way you can sense when something is off even when nobody says a word. And the person you love has started realizing that with you, hiding is difficult. They cannot easily pretend everything is fine when it is not. They cannot say, "I'm okay," and expect you to accept it without noticing the distance in their voice. You see what others miss. You pick up on shifts. You remember small things. You notice silence. And that scares them. Not because they dislike being understood, but because being truly understood means being truly seen. And being seen can be terrifying for someone who has spent a long time protecting parts of themselves. Stay with me, because this is where the real tension begins. The person you love has had relationships, friendships, or situations in their past where they learned how to survive by keeping part of themselves hidden. Maybe they learned not to say too much. Maybe they learned to make jokes instead of admitting when something hurt. Maybe they became independent because relying on someone once ended badly. Maybe they learned that if they kept emotional distance, no one could disappoint them completely. And then you appeared. You did not necessarily force them to open up. That would have been easier to resist. Instead, you simply paid attention. You listened differently. You remembered what they said. You noticed when their energy changed. You could feel when their words and their emotions did not match. And slowly, without intending to, you became the person around whom their usual defenses stopped working. That is the unexpected detail. Your emotional depth. Your ability to look beyond the surface. Your way of making them feel understood before they are ready to explain themselves. And last night, that detail became impossible for them to ignore. They were thinking about a moment between you. Maybe a conversation. Maybe a message. Maybe something small that you probably do not even remember. But they remembered it. They remembered saying they were fine when they clearly were not. And they remembered how you did not pressure them. You did not demand an explanation. You simply said something gentle, something that told them you knew there was more beneath the surface. Maybe it was, "You don't have to talk about it, but I know something is bothering you." And that sentence stayed with them. Because nobody had cornered them. Nobody had forced them. But somehow you had seen through the mask. And instead of using that vulnerability against them, you gave them space. That moment affected them much more than you realized. It made them feel safe. But it also frightened them. Because now they knew something. If this connection continued getting deeper, eventually they would not be able to hide behind the version of themselves they show everyone else. You would meet the real version. The uncertain version. The insecure version. The version that sometimes overthinks. The version that is afraid of being abandoned. The version that has made mistakes they still regret. The version that does not always know how to receive love when it is offered without conditions. And that realization created conflict. Their heart said, "Move closer." Their fear said, "Be careful." Their heart said, "Tell them everything." Their past said, "Once someone knows everything, they can hurt you with everything." Their heart said, "This feels different." Their fear said, "That is exactly why it is dangerous." And maybe now you understand why their behavior has seemed inconsistent at times. Maybe there were moments when they were incredibly warm, then suddenly distant. Moments when they opened up and then went quiet. Moments when they seemed ready to step forward and then hesitated. You may have wondered if they were changing their mind. But in this story, what if they were not changing their mind about you? What if they were becoming more aware of themselves? What if every step closer to you made them realize how deeply this connection could affect them? That is a very different kind of fear. It is not the fear of not wanting someone. It is the fear of wanting them so much that your old defenses no longer feel strong enough. Listen carefully to this next part, because this is where many people misunderstand emotional conflict. When someone loves you and still hesitates, it does not automatically mean their love is false. Sometimes hesitation appears precisely because the feeling is real enough to threaten the emotional habits they have used for years. A shallow connection is easy. You can walk away. You can stay casual. You can protect your pride. But a connection that reaches something deeper? That can expose everything. And the person you love has started realizing that you do not only make them feel loved. You make them want to become more honest. More emotionally present. More accountable. And that is where the unexpected detail becomes even more powerful. It is not just that you understand them. It is that you seem to expect emotional truth without even demanding it. Your presence makes half-truths feel uncomfortable. Your patience makes avoidance harder to justify. Your kindness makes them question why they still keep parts of themselves locked away. And last night, they asked themselves a difficult question. If this person really sees me, what happens when they see the parts one am not proud of? That question stayed with them. Maybe they looked at your photo. Maybe they reread an old message. Maybe they simply lay awake thinking about the way you respond when they are vulnerable. And one possibility kept returning: what if you do not leave? You might think that would comfort them. And part of them is comforted. But another part is deeply unsettled by it. Because if you stay after seeing their flaws, then they have to face the possibility that the negative things they believe about themselves were never completely true. Think about that. Sometimes people hold on to painful beliefs because those beliefs are familiar. I am too difficult. I always ruin good things. People eventually leave. If someone knows the real me, they will lose interest. Those beliefs hurt, but they also create predictability. If you expect rejection, you can protect yourself before it arrives. But then someone comes along and treats you differently. Someone sees the mess and does not immediately run. Someone hears the truth and responds with compassion. Someone notices the fear beneath the behavior. Suddenly, the old story begins to collapse. And losing an old story, even a painful one, can feel frightening because then you have to learn a new way of living. That is what you are triggering in this person. Not intentionally. Not magically. Simply through the way you show up. And now they are conflicted because loving you means they may have to stop being the person they became in order to survive earlier disappointments. They may have to communicate instead of disappearing. They may have to admit when they are scared. They may have to say what they need. They may have to trust instead of constantly preparing for the worst. They may have to accept that someone can care for them without making them earn every ounce of affection. And my goodness, that sounds beautiful when you say it quickly. But living it can be terrifying. Because real intimacy asks people to surrender control. Not all control, but the illusion that they can guarantee they will never be hurt. That is the detail about you that has them conflicted. You make emotional honesty feel possible. And if honesty becomes possible, hiding starts becoming a choice. The person you love knows this now. They know they cannot stay in the middle forever. They cannot keep enjoying your warmth while refusing to offer clarity. They cannot keep opening the door and closing it every time vulnerability enters the room. At some point, they have to decide what kind of connection they are willing to build with you. And last night, that decision came closer than ever. But there is another layer. One I have not told you yet. Their conflict is not only about what you see in them. It is also about what they see in you. There is something about your independence that has unsettled them. Yes, your independence. The fact that even though you care deeply, you still have the ability to walk away from confusion. You may love with your whole heart, but somewhere inside you, they sense that you are learning not to abandon yourself for someone else. And that changes the balance completely. Maybe in the past, they were used to people chasing harder when they pulled away. Maybe distance made others prove themselves more. Maybe emotional inconsistency gave them a sense of control. But with you, something feels different. You may feel deeply, but you are not endlessly available for uncertainty. You may be patient, but patience is not the same as having no boundaries. And they have noticed that. They noticed the moment you stopped asking the same questions. They noticed when you became quieter, not because you stopped caring, but because you started protecting your own peace. They noticed when your energy shifted from, "Please choose me," to, "I care about you, but I also choose myself." And that detail about you has created an entirely new kind of conflict. Because now they understand that love is not enough if they refuse to show up. They cannot simply assume you will remain in the same emotional place forever. You are growing too. You are becoming clearer about what you need. And somewhere inside, they know that if they keep hesitating indefinitely, one day they might finally become ready only to discover you are no longer waiting. That possibility has been haunting them. Not because they believe you belong to them. You do not. But because they know they may lose the chance to build something meaningful simply because they were too afraid to step into it while the door was open. And last night, they admitted something to themselves. Something they have been avoiding for a long time. They are not confused about whether they love you. They are confused about whether they are brave enough to love you in the way you deserve. Read that again. The question is not, "Do I feel something?" The feeling is there. The question is, can I be consistent? Can I communicate? Can I stop running from hard conversations? Can I let someone see me without turning vulnerability into distance? Can I receive the kind of love I keep saying I want? Those are harder questions. And you cannot answer them for this person. You cannot love them into emotional readiness. You cannot prove yourself enough to remove every fear from their past. That work belongs to them. And maybe that is what makes this connection so intense. Because you are not here to rescue them from themselves. You are forcing them, simply through your presence, to decide whether they want to grow. But stay with me, because something happened during that realization that changed the direction of their thoughts. They began remembering the times you made mistakes too. Yes, you. Because they had been placing you on a pedestal in certain ways, imagining you as emotionally stronger, more certain, more fearless than you really are. But then they remembered your vulnerable moments. The times you doubted yourself. The moments when you became quiet because you were hurt. The times you were afraid of being too much or not enough. And suddenly, they realized you were not asking them to be perfect because you were not perfect either. You were asking them to be real. That distinction hit them hard. Maybe all this time, they thought they needed to heal every wound before they could come closer to you. Maybe they thought they needed to become completely confident, completely secure, completely certain. But nobody reaches some magical point where they never feel fear again. Healthy love is not two fearless people meeting. It is two imperfect people learning how to tell the truth while fear is still in the room. And when the person you love understood that, some of the conflict changed. Not disappeared. Changed. Fear became less like a warning to run and more like a signal that there was something important to face. They started asking, what if I do not need to be perfect? What if I only need to be honest? That question opened something. Because honesty felt possible. Difficult, but possible. They could tell you they cared. They could tell you they were scared. They could tell you they sometimes pulled away because the connection mattered more than they knew how to handle. They could acknowledge that their inconsistency may have hurt you. They could ask what you needed instead of guessing. They could listen without defending themselves. None of those things required perfection. They required courage. And for the first time, courage seemed less impossible. But then another thought arrived. One that made them stop completely. What if you already know? What if you already understand that their distance comes from fear? And what if you are simply waiting to see whether they will take responsibility for it? That possibility changed everything. Because understanding someone is not the same as excusing everything they do. You can know why someone pulls away and still decide you need consistency. You can have compassion for their wounds and still refuse to let those wounds become an excuse for endless confusion. And the person you love knows that somewhere inside. They know your empathy is not weakness. They know your patience should not be taken for granted. They know that the very detail about you that makes them feel safest, your emotional understanding, is also the detail that makes it impossible for them to pretend forever. You see them. But you also see yourself. And that means this connection cannot survive on one person doing all the emotional work. That is where they are now. Standing between two versions of themselves. The old version says, stay safe. Keep some distance. Do not say too much. Wait until you are absolutely certain. The new version says, tell the truth. Show up. Risk being known. Let the other person decide what they want with the real you. And last night, the new version became louder. Not loud enough to erase every fear, but loud enough that they could no longer ignore it. They reached for their phone. They thought about messaging you. They imagined your name appearing on the screen. They imagined telling you something honest instead of vague. And for a moment, they almost did it. But then they stopped because there was one final thing they needed to understand about themselves first. One final detail connected to you that had been confusing them from the beginning. And this is the part you need to hear carefully, because it changes the entire meaning of their hesitation. They realize that what scares them most about you is not your ability to see through them. It is not your independence. It is not even the possibility of losing you. What scares them most is the way you make them imagine a future they had stopped believing they could have. A peaceful future. A stable future. A future where love is not constant guessing, chasing, proving, and recovering. And that kind of future feels unfamiliar enough to be frightening. They know chaos. They understand distance. They know how to protect themselves when something feels unstable. But peace? Peace requires a different skill. Peace requires staying. Peace requires trusting what is good instead of waiting for it to collapse. Peace requires accepting that love does not always have to hurt to be meaningful. And you, somehow, have become associated with that possibility in their mind. That is why they are conflicted. Because loving you means they may have to release an entire emotional identity built around survival. They may have to believe that something good can stay. They may have to believe they deserve it. And that is harder than simply saying, "I love you." But here is what happened next. After sitting with all of this, the person you love made a quiet decision. They decided they would stop asking themselves whether they were completely ready. Instead, they would ask a new question: what is one honest thing I can do next? Not 10 steps. Not a promise about forever. One honest step. Maybe a conversation. Maybe an apology. Maybe telling you something they had been hiding. Maybe simply asking how you really feel instead of assuming. And as soon as they made that decision, a specific memory of you returned. A moment from your past together. Something you said that they misunderstood at the time. Something they now realize may have been your way of telling them exactly what you needed. That memory has become the key to what they are planning to say next. And the strange part is, you probably do not even remember saying it. But they remember. Word for word. Because last night, for the first time, they finally understood what you meant. And once you hear what that sentence was, you will understand why this conflict has lasted so long, why they kept moving closer and then pulling away, and why they are now closer than ever to finally telling you the truth they have been afraid to say. You stayed because something in you knew that the sentence they remembered was not random. It had been sitting quietly in the back of their mind for longer than they realized, waiting for the right moment to make sense. And last night, after everything they had been feeling, after all the confusion, all the pulling closer and stepping back, all the moments when they almost told you the truth and then convinced themselves to wait, that sentence came back with a different meaning. You may have said it casually. You may not even remember the exact moment. But they do. They remember the expression on your face. They remember the pause before you said it. They remember how they avoided responding fully because the words touched something they were not ready to face. You said, "I do not need you to have all the answers. I just need to know when you are being real with me." At the time, they heard pressure. They heard expectation. They heard a demand they were afraid they could not meet. But now, after sitting with their feelings and finally seeing the conflict clearly, they understand what you were actually saying. You were not asking for certainty. You were asking for honesty. You were not asking them to promise forever. You were asking them to stop making you guess about today. And that realization hit them harder than almost anything else. Because all this time, they had been waiting to become completely sure before speaking. Completely healed before opening up. Completely fearless before choosing vulnerability. But you had never asked for perfection. You had asked for truth. And truth was available to them the entire time. Stay with me, because this is where their conflict begins to shift into something else. They started looking back at every moment when they could have been honest and were not. Not because they wanted to deceive you, but because they thought uncertainty meant silence was safer. They remembered times you asked how they were feeling and they said, "I'm fine." They remembered moments when you sensed distance and they told you it was nothing. They remembered wanting to say, "I miss you," but choosing a casual message instead. They remembered almost admitting that your presence had become important to them, then turning the conversation into a joke. And now, for the first time, they saw how all those small choices may have created one large misunderstanding. You may have thought they did not care enough. They may have thought they were protecting the connection by not saying too much. Two people experiencing the same bond through completely different interpretations. That is the dangerous thing about silence. It gives everyone room to invent their own explanation. And when someone already carries old fears, they will usually choose the explanation that hurts them most. Maybe you told yourself, if they wanted me, they would show it. Maybe they told themselves, if I show too much, I will lose control. Maybe you thought their distance was rejection. Maybe they thought your quietness meant you were preparing to leave. And neither of you said enough to know what was true. That is why this one sentence mattered so much. I do not need you to have all the answers. I just need to know when you are being real with me. Suddenly, they understood that you had given them permission to be uncertain. Permission to be imperfect. Permission to say, I care, but I am scared. And they had missed it because fear translated everything into danger. But now they could finally hear you. And once they could hear you, they began asking themselves a question that made them uncomfortable. If you had already shown that you could handle the truth, why had they continued hiding? The answer was painful but simple. Because the person they were protecting was not you. It was themselves. They were protecting themselves from the vulnerability of being known. They were protecting themselves from the possibility that if they told you everything and you still left, they could no longer pretend you only left because you never knew how they felt. Silence gave them an excuse. Honesty would remove it. And that is the deeper conflict you need to understand. The person you love did not only fear losing you. They feared losing their ability to explain the loss in a way that protected their pride. If they stayed vague and the connection ended, they could tell themselves, it just never became anything. But if they told you the truth, if they admitted how deeply you affected them, if they showed you the vulnerable parts and you still chose another path, then the loss would feel real. And real loss cannot be minimized. It has to be felt. That was what they had been avoiding. But last night, something inside them changed because they realized that avoiding possible pain was already creating pain. They were already missing you while you were still there. Already feeling regret about words they had not said. Already wondering whether the distance between you had grown because of their hesitation. They were suffering in advance to avoid suffering later. And suddenly, the logic of fear began to collapse. What was the point of protecting themselves from losing you if their protection was slowly pushing you away? That question stayed with them. And as it did, they started seeing another unexpected detail about you. Something that made the conflict even stronger, but also made the path forward clearer. They realized that you were not asking to be chased. You were not demanding grand gestures. You were not asking them to prove their love in some dramatic way. What you seemed to respond to most was consistency. Small things. A message when they said they would message. A real answer instead of a vague one. A simple, "I was thinking about you," instead of silence. A willingness to talk when something felt uncomfortable. And that realization mattered because consistency felt less impossible than some huge declaration. They did not need to transform overnight. They needed to stop disappearing emotionally whenever things became real. They could do that one choice at a time. Maybe this connection had been frightening because they kept imagining the final destination instead of the next honest step. They thought loving you meant knowing exactly what the future would look like. But perhaps loving you could begin with something much simpler: showing up today. Saying what they mean today. Listening today. Repairing what they can today. That thought calmed them. Not completely. The fear was still there. But now there was a path through it. And then they remembered another moment between you. A moment when they pulled away unexpectedly and you did something they never forgot. You did not chase. You did not punish. You did not create drama. You simply became quieter. You gave them the space they seemed to be asking for. At the time, a part of them was relieved because they did not have to face the conversation. But another part was deeply unsettled. Because your silence was different from theirs. Their silence came from fear. Yours came from self-respect. You were not trying to manipulate them into coming closer. You were showing them that you would not force a connection that was not being met halfway. And they noticed. They noticed how different the atmosphere became. They noticed that your warmth was still there, but no longer reaching endlessly across the distance. They noticed that you had stopped carrying the entire emotional weight of the connection. And maybe that is when their conflict became impossible to ignore. Because suddenly, the possibility of losing you was not some distant idea. It was happening in small ways. The connection was changing. You were changing. Not because you stopped loving them, but because you were learning that love without reciprocity can become exhaustion. They sensed that. And it scared them. Not because they wanted control over you, but because they realized your patience was never a guarantee. You were offering love, not a lifetime contract to remain confused. And that brought them face to face with the detail about you that perhaps challenged them the most: you could love deeply without abandoning yourself. Maybe they had never experienced that before. Maybe they were used to relationships where someone either became completely dependent or completely detached. But you were showing another possibility. You could care and still have boundaries. You could be compassionate and still need clarity. You could understand their wounds and still refuse to let those wounds decide the entire relationship. And that kind of love demands growth. It does not allow someone to hide forever behind their past. It says, gently but clearly, "I understand why you are afraid. But what are you going to do with that fear?" And last night, they finally asked themselves that question. What were they going to do with it? Keep letting it make every decision? Keep calling it timing? Keep confusing protection with wisdom? Or begin learning how to feel afraid and still move honestly? That is where the shift happened. Because for the first time, they stopped treating fear as evidence that the connection was wrong. They started treating fear as information about where they still needed to grow. Think about the difference. Before, when closeness made them nervous, they thought, maybe this is too much. Now, they started asking, why does being cared for make me want to run? Before, when you understood them too quickly, they thought, I need space. Now, they asked, why does being seen feel dangerous? Before, when you became quieter after their distance, they thought, maybe they are losing interest. Now, they asked, did I give them a reason to feel safe staying close? These were new questions. Hard questions. But they were honest. And honesty was beginning to replace avoidance. Stay with me here, because the next realization changed how they saw you completely. They had spent so much time focusing on how vulnerable they felt around you that they had not considered how vulnerable you had been too. They remembered the times you showed them your softer side. The things you admitted reluctantly. The moments when you trusted them with fears you did not share easily. The way you tried to communicate even when you were uncertain how they would respond. And suddenly, they understood something they had overlooked: you had already taken risks. You had already stepped forward in ways they were still afraid to. You had not asked them to enter emotional territory alone. You had been there too. Maybe not perfectly. Maybe you had your own walls. But you had shown enough of yourself to make the connection real. And recognizing that created a new kind of responsibility. They could no longer tell themselves, "I am the only one risking something." You were risking too. Your heart was involved too. Your dignity, your hope, your expectations, your emotional safety. All of it mattered. And if they loved you, truly loved you, then they had to care about what their hesitation was doing to you. Not punish themselves. Not drown in guilt. But take responsibility. That is what love sometimes looks like. Not saying, "I never meant to hurt you," and stopping there. But asking, "Even if I did not mean to, did my behavior hurt you? And what can I do differently?" The person you love began understanding that intention and impact are not always the same. They may have intended to protect both of you by moving slowly. But if the result was confusion, then they needed to acknowledge it. They may have intended to wait until they felt ready. But if the waiting made you feel unwanted, they needed to understand that too. And something about that realization made them want to speak to you differently. Not defensively. Not with excuses. With curiosity. They wanted to ask what the connection had felt like from your side. They wanted to hear what their silence had communicated to you. They wanted to know whether there were moments you almost walked away. They wanted to understand what you needed now, not what they assumed you needed months ago. And that desire to listen was perhaps one of the clearest signs that their feelings had matured. Because early attraction often asks, "How do I make this person choose me?" Mature love asks, "How do I understand this person better?" Early fear asks, "What if I get hurt?" Mature love also asks, "What if I am hurting them without realizing it?" That shift was happening in them. Slowly. Uncomfortably. But genuinely. And then another detail surfaced. Something they had almost forgotten. There was a time when you told them, perhaps indirectly, that you did not need constant attention. You just needed consistency when it mattered. They had interpreted that as you being easygoing, independent, low maintenance. But now they understood the deeper meaning. You were not saying you needed nothing. You were saying you did not want to beg for basic emotional presence. There is a difference. And once they saw that, they began recognizing every moment when you had communicated your needs quietly instead of dramatically. Maybe you said, "Just tell me if something changes." Maybe you said, "I would rather know the truth than guess." Maybe you said, "If you need space, just say that." Simple requests. Reasonable requests. And yet fear had made them hear those requests as pressure because any expectation of communication felt like responsibility. Now they were seeing it differently. You were not trying to control them. You were trying to create safety for both of you. And that made them feel something unexpected: admiration. Yes, admiration. Because they began seeing your emotional clarity not as something intimidating, but as something they wanted to learn from. You could say what you needed without trying to force an outcome. You could step back without becoming cruel. You could care without turning love into possession. You could be vulnerable while still maintaining self-respect. And they realized that maybe the detail about you that had them so conflicted was also the detail that was teaching them what a healthier connection could look like. You were not perfect. But you were showing them a different pattern. And patterns can be frightening when someone has spent years living inside another one. Their old pattern said intensity equals love. Your presence suggested consistency could be love. Their old pattern said distance creates safety. You were showing that honest communication creates safety. Their old pattern said vulnerability gives someone power over you. You were showing that vulnerability can create mutual trust when handled with care. Their old pattern said if you need someone, you become weak. You were showing that choosing connection does not require losing yourself. No wonder they were conflicted. You were not simply asking them to love you. You were challenging their definition of love without even trying. And the deeper their feelings became, the harder it was to return to the old definitions. But that created another fear. If they changed, who would they become? If they stopped running, stopped hiding, stopped treating independence like emotional isolation, would they still recognize themselves? Growth sounds beautiful from a distance, but up close, growth can feel like losing an identity. Even when the identity was built around survival. The person you love had become skilled at not needing too much. At keeping emotional exits available. At maintaining control. Those habits had helped them through difficult times. And now, loving you seemed to ask them to loosen some of those habits. Not become dependent. Not lose themselves. But allow interdependence. Allow another person to matter enough that their choices consider both hearts. That felt new. And new can feel dangerous even when it is healthy. But last night, instead of running from that feeling, they sat with it. They asked themselves, what if I am not losing myself? What if I am becoming more of myself? That question changed everything. Because maybe the version of them who communicates, who loves openly, who repairs mistakes, who allows closeness, is not some foreign person. Maybe that version was always there, buried underneath fear. Maybe you were not demanding that they become someone else. Maybe your presence was giving them permission to become someone they had secretly wanted to be. Someone who does not have to pretend not to care. Someone who can say, I miss you, without feeling weak. Someone who can admit, I am scared, without believing fear makes them unworthy. Someone who can choose another person without losing themselves. And the moment they considered that, their conflict softened. It did not vanish. But it stopped feeling like a wall and started feeling like a doorway. A doorway they could walk through slowly. One honest choice at a time. And then, sometime later that night, they reached for their phone again. Your name was there. Your conversation. All those small pieces of history between you. They scrolled back farther than they intended. And then they found it. The exact exchange where you had said the sentence that was now changing everything. They read your words again. I do not need you to have all the answers. I just need to know when you are being real with me. And underneath, they saw their own response. Something short. Something vague. Maybe a joke. Maybe a simple, I know. Maybe they had changed the subject. And suddenly they felt the weight of everything they had not said in that moment. They wished they could go back and answer differently. But you cannot rewrite old conversations. You can only decide what kind of conversation you create next. And that became their focus. Not regret. Not self-punishment. The next conversation. They began typing. Slowly. Carefully. Not a dramatic confession. Something real. I have been thinking about something you said to me a long time ago. They paused. Then continued. You told me you did not need me to have all the answers. You just wanted me to be real with you. I think I finally understand what you meant. Their hearts started racing immediately. Because even this opening felt vulnerable. It told you they remembered. It told you your words mattered. It told you something was changing. They kept going. I think I spent too much time trying to figure everything out before I said anything, and I probably made you feel like I felt less than I did. Then they stopped. That sentence scared them. Because there it was. The admission beneath all the conflict. They felt more than they showed. Much more. And once they typed it, they could not pretend otherwise. They stared at the screen. They considered deleting the entire message. Old instinct. Old defense. But they did not. Instead, they took a breath and wrote another line. The truth is, I care about you enough that it scares me. That was the confession. Not, I have everything figured out. Not, I promise nothing will ever go wrong. Simply, I care enough that it scares me. Honest. Imperfect. Human. And maybe that is exactly the kind of truth you had been asking for all along. They looked at those words for a long time. Then they added something even more important. But I do not want fear to keep deciding how I treat you. And that sentence changed the entire message. Because feelings are one thing. Choices are another. They were not only admitting love. They were admitting responsibility for what they did with that love. They wanted to behave differently. Communicate differently. Stop making you carry the uncertainty alone. And as they read the message back, something inside them felt lighter. Not because they knew how you would respond. They did not. You could be cautious. You could be hurt. You could need time. You could say the connection had changed too much. There were no